The cold did not just bite, it burrowed. It found the holes in her boots and the threadbare patches in her coat, and it settled deep in her marrow. Clara had been running for 3 days, fueled by a terror that was finally losing its race against starvation. The mountains of Idaho Territory were indifferent to her plight. The spring thaw was a cruel joke, releasing just enough mud to suck at her feet, but leaving a hard frost on the ground every dawn. She had followed the thin curl of wood smoke for miles, a ghost clinging to the scent of life. Now, she crouched behind a split-rail fence, her body a single, agonizing tremble. A cabin sat in the clearing, sturdy and silent, its windows dark. But near the tree line, there was a coop. Clara closed her eyes, her stomach twisting into a knot of such profound emptiness it felt like a physical blow. She had not eaten, truly eaten, in days. She had chewed on pine needles and swallowed icy water, but the hunger was a beast clawing at her insides. The sky was a bruised pre-dawn purple. There was no movement from the cabin. Risk was all she had left. She moved low and fast, her feet making almost no sound on the frosted dirt. The coop door was held by a simple wooden latch. She lifted it, the scrape of wood feeling as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. A few hens stirred, clucking softly. Tears blurred her vision. Eggs. 3, no, 4, nestled in the straw. They were warm. She grabbed 2, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped them. She fumbled them into the deep pocket of her coat, the delicate warmth pressing against her ribs. She reached for a 3rd, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Just one more. A boot scraped stone behind her. Clara froze. The air left her lungs. Slowly, she turned. He was a silhouette against the rising light, tall as the pines that surrounded his homestead. He was a shape of a man, broad in the shoulder, and utterly still. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the dark tangle of a beard and the glint of the rising sun on something that was not skin on the left side of his face. She did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only brought the wrong kind of attention. She bolted. It was pure instinct, the flight of a deer. She burst from the coop, scrambling toward the fence line, toward the dark safety of the trees. She heard no shout, no footfall in pursuit, but she ran with the last spark of adrenaline in her body. The world tilted, the copper-colored sky spun, and the ground, slick with mud and ice, rushed up to meet her. The last thing she felt was a sharp crack as the eggs in her pocket broke against her ribs. The loss of the food was a sharper pain than the impact. Then, blackness took her. Silas watched her fall. He had seen the desperation in the way she moved, the animal quickness. He had seen thinner, but not by much. He walked over to where she lay, a heap of wet rags and tangled brown hair in the mud. He nudged her boot with his own. Nothing. She was out. With a sigh that seemed to draw up from the ground itself, he bent down. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She weighed nothing, less than a sack of feed. He lifted her, her head lolling back. Filth and exhaustion radiated from her. He carried her toward the cabin, his scarred face set in the same expression it always wore, a kind of permanent neutrality, a deep stillness carved by loss and isolation. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. The cabin was one room, clean but sparse. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire burning. A bedroll lay on a cot in one corner, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and bacon grease. He laid her not on his own bed, but on the bearskin rug before the fire. She was soaked, and the cold had settled in her. He fetched a rough blanket from his trunk and covered her, then went about his morning. He made coffee, his movements economical. He stoked the fire, adding another log, and the heat in the room began to rise. He sat in one of the chairs, sipping the hot, black coffee from a tin mug, and he watched her. Clara woke with a gasp. Her first sensation was warmth. It was so foreign, so complete, that it terrified her. Her second was fear. She was inside. She was dry. She scrambled backward, crab walking away from the fire until her back hit the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, her eyes wide and animal bright. He was there, the man from the clearing. He sat at the table, bathed in the morning light streaming through the single window. He was tall, yes, and weathered like an old axe handle. His hair was long, dark, and tied back with a leather thong. And the scars, they were not a glancing blow. The left side of his face, from temple to jaw, was a ruin of melted, puckered skin that pulled his eye and the corner of his mouth into a permanent, unsettling grimace. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, the very ribs that were now sticky with cold. Broken egg. She braced herself. She knew this part. She knew what men did when they had you trapped. They would feed you, perhaps, but there was always a price. She waited for the leer, the demand, the rough hand. The mountain man just sipped his coffee. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic pounding in her ears. He looked at her, his one good eye a clear, piercing gray. The scarred one was milky, but it, too, was fixed on her. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, like stones shifting at the bottom of a creek. You want to work or wear white beside me forever? Clara stared. The words made no sense. They hung in the air, thick and strange. She must have misheard. The hunger was making her mind play tricks. What? She whispered, her throat raw. He did not repeat himself. He did not explain. He just held her gaze, his scarred face impassive. He had asked a question, and he was waiting for an answer. Her mind raced, trying to dissect the meaning. Work. That meant chores, labor, servitude. It meant earning her keep. It was a language she understood, even if it was hard. But wear white? Beside him? Forever? Marriage. The idea was so absurd, so monstrous. It stole her breath. Men like him did not marry girls like her. Men like him used girls like her. Girls who were filthy and starving and had nowhere else to go. Girls who had spent the last 2 years in a place like Murphy's Gulch, passed between miners and gamblers until she was nothing but a worn-out thing. This was a trap, a cruel joke, a test to see how desperate she truly was. If she chose wear white, he would laugh, or he would claim her in a way that had nothing to do with churches or white dresses. Work was the only real answer. It was the only answer that kept her body her own, even if her hands and back would belong to him. Work, she said. The word was a croak, but it was decisive. Silas nodded once, slowly. He drained his coffee mug and stood. The sheer size of him filled the small cabin, made the air feel thin. There's water in the basin, he said, gesturing to a small stand by the door. And soap. There's stew in the pot. Eat, then. The wood needs splitting. He pulled on a heavy sheepskin coat, grabbed an axe from beside the door, and left. He did not lock her in. He just left. Clara stayed frozen against the wall for a full minute, listening to the solid, rhythmic thud of the axe striking wood outside. He had left her, alone, with food. She moved, every muscle aching, and crept to the window. She saw him at the woodpile, his back to the cabin. He swung the axe with an easy, powerful grace, the muscles in his back bunching under his shirt. She turned to the pot hanging over the fire, lifting the lid. The smell of venison and root vegetables hit her so hard she nearly fainted again. It was thick and hot. She found a bowl and a spoon, her hands shaking so badly she could barely serve herself. She ate standing by the fire, shoveling the hot stew into her mouth, burning her tongue, not caring. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was life. She ate 2 bowls, her stomach cramping in protest before finally, blessedly, settling. Only then did she tend to herself. She went to the basin. The water was icy, But the soap was lye and it cut through the grime. She washed her face and hands, the cold water stinging. She saw her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror nailed to the wall. She looked haunted, a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger with mud in her hair. She thought about running again. She could walk right out the door. He was outside, his back turned. She could be in the trees in seconds. But where would she go? Back down the mountain, to be dragged back to Murphy's Gulch, or further up, to freeze or starve. The hunger was gone, replaced by a dull, aching exhaustion. But the stew was a promise. The work was a promise. She looked at the broken eggs crusted to her coat. She had been caught stealing, and instead of a beating, she had been given a blanket and a hot meal. It made no sense, and that, more than anything, kept her there. She found a rag and cleaned the sticky mess from her pocket and her coat. She tidied the bowl, setting it by the basin. She took a deep breath, wrapped the borrowed blanket around her shoulders over her thin coat, and pushed open the cabin door. He did not stop his swinging. "The axe is there," he said, nodding toward a smaller axe leaning against the chopping block. "Split the kindling. Stack it by the door." Clara picked it up. The handle was smooth but heavy. Her hands were soft, her arms weak. Her first swing was clumsy, missing the log entirely. Silas stopped and watched. "Hold it higher. Let the weight of the head do the work. And watch your feet. I've no mind to stitch up a toe." She tried again and again. It was clumsy, exhausting work. Her palms began to blister almost immediately. But she did not stop. She set her jaw, the shame of her weakness burning in her, and she swung the axe. She would work. She would prove she was not useless. She would earn the stew. They worked in silence for hours. The only sounds were the two axes, his steady, splitting thunk, and her frantic, weaker chop. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both brutal and numbing. Clara learned that work on Silas's homestead was not a single task. It was an endless list of them. She learned to clean the stalls in the small barn that housed his single mule and 2 dairy cows. The smell was rich and earthy, a sharp contrast to the stale whiskey and cheap perfume of the saloon. She learned to mend the fences where the winter snows had broken the wire, her fingers stiff and bleeding in the cold. She learned to haul water from the creek, a rushing, angry torrent of snowmelt that threatened to pull her in. And she learned to chop wood. Every day, she chopped wood. Her hands, once soft, became a raw mess of blisters that burst, bled, and slowly began to form calluses. Her back screamed. Her shoulders felt like they were being pulled from their sockets. Through it all, Silas was a constant, overwhelming presence. He was not cruel. He was not kind. He simply was. He worked from before sunup to after sundown, a tireless, silent machine. He taught her what needed doing with few words. "That's not right. Pull the wire taut before you staple. Scrape the muck down to the wood, all of it. Swing from your shoulders, not your back." And most importantly, he never touched her. Not once. He never brushed against her in the narrow confines of the cabin. He never let his fingers graze hers when he passed her a piece of bread. He never offered a hand when she stumbled with the heavy water buckets. To Clara, this absence of touch was the strangest thing of all. She was so accustomed to being appraised, grabbed, and pushed that his careful, almost reverent distance was a constant source of confusion. He slept on his cot, and she slept on the bearskin rug by the hearth, which she had now claimed as her own. He gave her the blanket without comment, taking a second, rougher one for himself from the trunk. They lived like 2 ghosts in that small cabin, orbiting each other but never colliding. Each of them was nursing invisible wounds. Clara would find herself freezing at the sound of a raised voice, not that Silas ever raised his, or flinching if he moved too quickly to grab a tool. She was defensive, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the quiet work to become the other, more familiar kind. Silas, for his part, was a fortress of silence. His grief, or whatever it was that haunted him, was a well he never drew from. He just guarded it. He would sit for an hour, staring into the fire, his scarred face looking like something carved from tormented rock. The cabin was their world. It was surrounded by towering pines that sighed in the wind. The creek roared, a constant reminder of the melting snow and the isolation. At night, the sky was a black velvet sheet punched through with millions of stars. And the dusk turned the entire western sky to a shade of bruised copper, a color so beautiful it made Clara's chest ache. She had been there for perhaps 2 weeks when she began to notice him watching her. It was different from his direct, instructional gaze when she was failing at a task. This was quieter. She would be kneading dough for their bread, her hands clumsy in the flour, and she would feel his eyes on her. She would look up, and he would look away, back to mending a piece of tack. She would be washing the tin plates, her back to him, and the silence would feel heavier. She would turn and catch him staring at her profile, his expression unreadable. She had been looked at by men her entire life. She knew the look of hunger, of appraisal, of contempt, of raw possession. This was none of those. There was no malice in his eyes. There was something else, a deep, profound sadness, a curiosity. It was a look that did not make her feel like a piece of meat. It made her feel terrifyingly like a person. One afternoon, Silas rode the mule down the mountain to check his trap lines. He told her to bar the door and keep the rifle, which he had shown her how to load but not yet fire, close at hand. The silence of the cabin without him was deafening. She found herself uneasy, pacing. She finished her chores early, sweeping the floor, banking the fire. She found herself by his cot, his spare blanket folded neatly. Beside it was a small, crudely made drawer set into the wall. It was slightly ajar. She had no right. She knew she had no right. But she was starved for something other than food. She was starved for understanding. Her hand trembled as she pulled it open. Inside there was very little: a whetstone, a few dried bullets, and a small, silver locket, tarnished with age. It was light in her palm. She fumbled with the clasp, her rough fingers clumsy. It sprang open. It was not a portrait. It was a piece of faded, folded paper. She opened it. It was a child's drawing, a crude stick figure with bright yellow hair, drawn in wax or crayon. Next to it was a lopsided sun. It was the kind of thing a very small child makes, full of innocence and certainty. Clara's throat tightened. She snapped the locket shut, shoved it back in the drawer, and pushed the drawer closed. She felt sick, as if she had violated something sacred. When Silas returned at dusk, carrying 3 rabbits, he found her staring into the fire, her face pale. He knew. He did not ask how. He just knew. He set the rabbits on the table, his movement slower than usual. He looked at the drawer, then at her. The silence in the cabin was stretched thin, brittle as ice. Clara waited for the rage, for the accusation. He said nothing. He just skinned the rabbits for supper. And she asked nothing. The question died in her throat. Whatever that locket meant, it was his and his alone. That night, the dam inside her finally broke. The numbness that had protected her since Murphy's Gulch, the hard shell she had built around her heart, cracked. After Silas had settled onto his cot and the cabin was dark, she lay on her rug and the tears came. They were not loud, wailing sobs. They were the quiet, choking, hopeless tears of someone who had learned to cry without making a sound. She cried for the girl she had been, for the eggs she had stolen, for the child's drawing in the locket, and for the terrifying, scarred man who had offered her a choice she still did not understand. She muffled the sounds in the bearskin, her body shaking. Across the room, Silas lay perfectly still, his eyes open to the dark. He heard every hitched breath. He pretended to be asleep. He waited until her breathing had steadied, though he knew she was not sleeping. Then in a single, fluid motion. He reached for the quilt at the foot of his cot, his only good quilt, the one filled with thick wool. He did not get up. He did not walk to her. He did not kneel and offer comfort. He gently, accurately, tossed it through the darkness. It landed on her shoulders, heavy and warm, smelling faintly of him, of wood smoke and pine and clean, cold air. Clara gasped, pulling it tight around her. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. The snow did not retreat. It was beaten back, day by day, inch by inch, by the relentless work of the sun and the two figures on the mountainside. The spring thaw was not a gentle awakening. It was a muddy, violent brawl. The creek, once a quiet ribbon of ice, became a roaring brown beast that tore at its banks and threatened to flood the low-lying field Silas had designated for a garden. This was the new work. It was not the maintenance work of winter. It was the work of building. "The ditch has to be deeper," Silas stated, his breath pluming in the sharp morning air. He stood over a long trench Clara had been digging for 2 days, meant to bleed water from the main creek to the garden plot. Clara leaned on the shovel, her whole body vibrating with exhaustion. Her hands were not just calloused, they were permanently stained with earth. "It's to the rock," she panted, swiping a muddy forearm across her brow. Silas picked up a heavy iron bar without a word. He jammed it into the earth at the end of her trench and threw his entire weight against it. There was a sharp crack. He levered the bar back, pulling up a slab of shale. "It's rock, but it'll break. Dig around it. The water has to get through before the ground hardens." She wanted to cry. She wanted to throw the shovel at his scarred face. Instead, she took a shuddering breath, picked up the shovel, and began to dig again, attacking the rock's edges. But a change was happening, one she felt before she saw. Her thin, trembling arms had firmed. Her shoulders, once sharp with hunger, now had a solid set to them. She could lift a full bucket of water without stumbling. She could swing the axe for an hour before her back began to seize. She was still gaunt, but the hollowness was filling in. And with the muscle came something else, a sliver of pride. When she looked at the neat stack of kindling, she had chopped it. When she saw the reinforced fence line, she had helped pull the wire taut. She was earning the stew. She was earning the quilt. She was earning the space she took up on the planet. One morning, after a breakfast of oats and black coffee, Silas did not head for the barn. He stayed in the cabin, cleaning his rifle, a long-barreled Winchester. He oiled the action with a practiced, almost tender motion. Clara watched him, her stomach tightening. She had not seen him use it, but she knew it was not for show. He finished, clicking the lever. He looked at her. "You're going to learn," he said. It was not a question. He led her out into the clearing. The air was bright, the sky a painful, cloudless blue. He set up an old tin can on a stump 50 yards away. "It'll kick," he said, pushing the rifle into her hands. The weight of it shocked her. It was heavy, solid, cold. It smelled of oil and power. She held it awkwardly, her arms shaking. "Stock to your shoulder. Tight. If you hold it loose, it'll break your bone." She tried to lift it, to aim, but it wobbled. She was terrified of it. She had seen guns used, always by angry, drunk men. They were instruments of ending things. "Cheek down on the wood. Line up the sight. Breathe out. Squeeze. Don't pull." She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. The rifle butt slammed into her shoulder, sending a shock of pain up her neck and down her arm. The sound rang in her ears, a deafening, painful whine. She dropped the rifle in the dirt and stumbled back, tears of shock and pain stinging her eyes. She had not even seen where the bullet went. Silas looked at the rifle in the dirt, then at her. His scarred mouth tightened. She braced for him to yell, to call her stupid and weak. He picked up the rifle, checked it for mud, and held it out to her again. "Your eyes were closed. You can't hit what you don't see. And you held it loose. Hold it tight, like you mean it. Try again. I can't, she whispered, rubbing her shoulder. You can, he said, his voice flat. What if I'm not here? What if a wolf comes for the chickens? What if a man comes for you? You think he'll care if you're scared of the noise? Hold the rifle. His words. What if a man comes for you? Hit her harder than the gun's recoil. She knew that fear. That was a fear that lived in her bones. She took the rifle, her jaw set. She lifted it. Her arms trembled, but she forced them to steady. She pressed the stock into the tender bruise on her shoulder, welcoming the pain. She put her cheek to the wood. She opened her eyes. She found the little nub of the sight, lined it up with a distant tin can. She let out half a breath. She squeezed. The crack was just as loud. The kick just as hard. But this time, she was ready. She held on, her body absorbing the shock. The tin can did not move. Again, he said, his voice quiet. She loaded, she aimed, she fired. This time, a puff of dust kicked up just to the left of the stump. She did it again and again. She fired until her shoulder was a single, throbbing ache and the smell of gunpowder was in her hair. On the sixth shot, the tin can leaped into the air and spun away. Clara lowered the rifle, her entire body humming. She had done it. She looked at Silas. He was watching her, his strange, mismatched eyes assessing. That's better, he murmured. A heat unconnected to the sun or the work rushed up her neck and flooded her face. It was a flush so intense it made her dizzy. It was pride. Yes, but it was something else, something warm and terrifyingly new. He had praised her. They fell deeper into their shared silence. The breakfasts were still quiet, but the air was different. It was no longer the silence of two strangers, but of two people who understood the map of each other's labor. He knew her day would be spent at the creek ditch. She knew his would be spent reinforcing the roof. They split the same loaf of dark bread, baked in the small Dutch oven. And one morning, as she reached for the salt, her hand brushed his. It was nothing, a fleeting graze of his rough knuckles against the back of her hand, but it felt like a static shock. She snatched her hand back as if burned. He, too, went rigid, his hand frozen over the table. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them looked up. But the spark of it lingered all day, a tiny, burning coal in her memory. He had not touched her, not on purpose, but she knew now what his skin felt like. It was calloused, and it was warm. The line between them, the one he had drawn so clearly, had been breached, and the breach remained, a shimmering, invisible thing in the air between them. A week later, the hawk came. Clara was in the coop, gathering the morning eggs. She had grown fond of the hens, of their stupid, clucking comfort. They were the only things on this mountain that were soft. She was counting the brown eggs, a small smile on her face, when a shadow passed over the doorway. It was fast, a dark shape, a streak of feathers, a terrible shriek from one of the hens. Clara burst out of the coop, yelling. A large hawk was on the ground, its talons sunk deep into the back of a small white hen. The other chickens were scattering, screaming in panic. Get out! Clara shrieked, grabbing a stick. She ran at the hawk, waving the stick, but the predator was unbothered. It looked at her with a cold, yellow eye, then gave a powerful flap of its wings, lifting its struggling, dying prey. In seconds, it was above the tree line, the hen's death cry fading. Clara stood, breathing hard, the stick held uselessly in her hand. The clearing was silent again, save for the panicked clucking of the surviving hens. It was so fast, so brutal. She had been right there. She dropped the stick, the frustration, the exhaustion of the past weeks, the terror of the rifle, the constant grinding work, the gnawing loneliness. It all coalesced into a single point of failure. She had failed to protect the one thing she felt a kinship with. She sank to her knees in the mud. She did not cry at first. She just shook. Then a low, Animal sound of frustration tore from her throat. She slammed her fist into the wet ground, and then the tears came, hot and furious. Silas came around the side of the barn, drawn by the commotion. He saw her on her knees, her shoulders shaking, her head bowed. He saw the scattered feathers on the ground. He looked up at the sky. He walked over to her slowly. Clara tensed, hearing his boots. She waited for him to tell her it was just a chicken, that she was weak for crying, that she had work to do. He did not. He just knelt beside her. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He just knelt in the mud, a tall, scarred witness to her grief. He stared out at the spot where the hawk had disappeared. His presence a solid, silent wall. His silence was a question. It was a space, and she, in her brokenness, felt a sudden, desperate need to fill it. "In Murphy's Gulch," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "That's where I was." He did not turn his head, but she knew he was listening. I worked in a saloon. The Red Dog." She scrubbed at her face with a muddy hand. "I was not a server. I was owned by the man who ran the place. He passed me between men, whoever had the coin." She was speaking to the trees, to the empty air, but he was there. "I was a thing, just a thing to be used up. For 2 years, I tried to run, but they always caught me. This last time, I ran until my feet were bloody. I did not even have shoes. I just ran." She finally looked at him. His face was unreadable, carved from stone and shadow. She had said it. She had told him. She had named the shame that coated her skin, the shame she could never wash off. Now he would look at her with contempt. Now he would see her as the thing she was. Silas was quiet for a long time. The wind sighed in the pines. "You survived," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That makes you stronger than most." Clara stared at him. She had expected disgust, or pity, or even a sick curiosity. She had not expected respect. He did not see her as soiled. He saw her as strong. She looked at his face, at the ruin of his skin. She had seen it as a mark of violence, something that made him frightening. Now, she saw it differently. He was marked, just as she was. His marks were on the outside. Hers were on the inside. That night, she built the fire. He sat at the table, sharpening a knife. The stew bubbled. The confession hung in the air. But it was not a foul smell. It was just a fact, laid bare. "How?" she asked, her voice small. He did not pretend to misunderstand. He kept his eyes on the whetstone. "A fire," he said. He tested the blade against his thumb. "Barn fire, middle of winter, a blizzard. I was in the house. The lamp in the barn must have turned over." His hand slowed. "My wife, Anne. She went out to check on a sick calf. She took our daughter, Elsie. She did not want to leave her alone." Clara put her hand over her mouth. The locket, the child's drawing. "By the time I smelled the smoke, it was too late. The whole thing was an inferno. The wind was high. I tried. God knows I tried." He touched his scarred cheek with his free hand. "I ran in. I could hear them. But the roof came down. It threw me back. The heat. It melted the skin right off me." He stopped, his throat working. "I woke up 2 days later. My neighbor had found me in the snow. I was the only one I survived. They did not." He set the knife down. "The town, they looked at me. They said I should have been in the barn. They said I should have saved them. They said a man who lives when his family dies like that. They blamed me. They looked at my face and they saw a monster who let his wife and child burn." He finally looked up at her, his one good eye a raw, gray ache. "So I left. I came up here, where there's no one to look." Clara finally understood. His silence was not a cold, empty thing. It was a well, a well of grief so deep that he spent his entire life just guarding the edge, terrified he would fall in. He was not a ghost. He was a man consumed by a fire that had never gone out. The fragile peace of their homestead was shattered 3 nights later. A storm rolled in from the north, a monster of wind and water. It came on fast, the sky turning a sickly green-black. The first crash of thunder was not a distant rumble. It was a cannon shot directly overhead that shook the very logs of the cabin. Clara dropped the plate she was washing. It shattered on the floor. She hated storms. In Murphy's Gulch, storms meant the men were trapped inside, drunk, mean, and with nothing to do but amuse themselves with the girls. The sound of thunder was the sound of a fist hitting a wall, of a door being kicked in. She backed against the wall, her hands over her ears, as another crack of thunder split the sky. Rain began to lash the cabin, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown against the roof. "It's just a squall," Silas said, barring the door. "It'll pass." But it did not pass. It worsened. The wind howled like a living thing, a chorus of demons. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in stark, terrifying white, followed by immediate, deafening thunder. Clara was trembling, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She slid down the wall, curling into a ball, trying to make herself small. She was back in that tiny, cold room, the one with the broken lock, hearing the heavy boots in the hall. Silas watched her. He put another log on the fire, the light steady and warm, but it did not matter. The storm was inside the room with her. She stayed there for hours, frozen, as the storm raged. Silas eventually blew out the lamp and lay down on his cot, but she knew he was not asleep. Around midnight, a bolt of lightning struck so close it sounded as if it had hit the cabin itself. The crack was absolute, a sound of the world splitting in two. Clara screamed. It was a raw, thin sound. She could not stay alone. She could not. She scrambled to her feet and, in the blackness between flashes, she ran. She did not run for the door. She ran to his cot. She stood over him, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Silode sat up. "Clara." I can't," she whimpered. I'm scared." Another flash of lightning lit the room, illuminating her terrified, tear-streaked face. He looked at her, and she saw the conflict in his eyes, the line, the boundary. She had crossed it. He sighed, a long, slow breath, and shifted his large body over to the far side of the cot, against the wall. He did not invite her. He just made space. Clara hesitated, then crawled onto the bed. She did not get under his blanket. She lay on top of the covers, rigid as a board, her back to him. The cot was small. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. Inches away, she could smell the soap and wood smoke on his skin. He did not touch her. He lay perfectly still, a solid, breathing presence in the dark. They lay there, inches apart, not touching. The storm raged outside, inside. The silence was louder than the thunder. It was filled with her fear, his grief, and the unspoken fragile thing that was growing between them. The storm finally broke near dawn. The thunder receded, leaving only the steady drum of rain. Clara had not slept, but the terror had eased, replaced by a profound, boneless exhaustion. In the gray, watery light of early morning, she felt him stir. She held her breath. He did not move away. He did not get up. He just lay there, his voice a low, rough whisper that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Still just work, or would you rather wear white?" Clara said nothing. The question was real now. It had weight. She did not answer, but she did not leave. That morning, after his whispered question, Clara had not moved. She lay on the cot, her back to him, every nerve ending alive. She felt him rise, his weight shifting off the mattress. He put on his boots, stoked the fire, and went outside. his movements as deliberate as ever. He did not press her for an answer. When she finally emerged from the cabin, the rain had softened to a drizzle. He was splitting wood, as if it were any other morning. She went to the coop. Neither of them spoke of the storm, or the cot, or the question. But the line was gone, the invisible barrier he had maintained, the careful 6 feet of distance, had dissolved in the thunder. She still moved her bearskin rug back to the hearth that night. It was her space, her claim, but the air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer brittle. It was thick with things unsaid, with a new, shared knowledge. The spring storms gave way to a relentless, vibrant sun. The Idaho summer arrived not gently, but in a rush of heat and life. The snowmelt receded, the creek calmed, and the world, which had been gray and brown, exploded into 1,000 shades of green. The pines seemed darker, the aspens a quivering, bright green, and the air grew heavy with the scent of dust and blooming syringa. The work changed. The brutal, groundbreaking labor of spring was replaced by the endless, meticulous tasks of summer. They hoed the garden, their backs bent under the hot sun, protecting the tender shoots of beans and squash. Clara learned to milk the 2 cows, her hands growing strong and nimble in a new way. She learned to churn butter, to mend Silas's shirts with the neat, small stitches, to identify the good berries from the poison ones. She was no longer weak. The gaunt, hollow-eyed creature who had collapsed in the mud was gone. Her body was hard and capable, her skin browned by the sun. She moved with a confidence that came from knowing the rhythm of the land. She knew when the cows needed water, when the garden needed weeding, when the bread was done rising. And one afternoon, while she was trying to shoo a stubborn mule back into its pen, the animal brayed, kicked up its heels, and trotted away. Clara put her hands on her hips, her frustration giving way to amusement. A sound bubbled up in her chest, one she had not heard in years. A laugh. It was a real, chest-deep laugh. The sound was so foreign it startled her into silence. She looked around, embarrassed, but Silas was watching her from the barn door. He was not laughing, but the good side of his mouth had quirked into something that was almost a smile. His one good eye was bright. He was changing, too. The fortress of his silence was still there, but he was making small allowances. One evening, he came back from checking the snares, and in his hand was a small, tight bunch of purple lupine and white columbine. He said nothing, just put them in a tin cup of water on the table. They were weeds, but they were beautiful. Clara found herself staring at them for an hour, a tight, strange ache in her chest. Another day, she returned to the cabin from the creek and found he had nailed a small, smooth shelf of pine to the wall beside the hearth. It was for her comb, her soap, her small things. It was a recognition that she lived here, that this was not just a place she worked. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet care that it moved her more than any pretty words could have. He was careful. He still never touched her, but his gaze would linger, and the silence between them was now comfortable, companionable. They would eat their supper on the small porch, watching the heat lightning flash silently over the distant peaks, and the quiet felt earned. The outside world did not exist. There was only the mountain, the cabin, the work, and the 2 of them. Until the afternoon, the trapper arrived. He was the first visitor Clara had seen since she arrived. He came up the trail on a tired-looking horse, a string of beaver pelts slung over its rump. He was a small, wiry man with a stained beard and eyes that were too close together. He smelled of whiskey and old blood, a scent that immediately transported Clara back to the Red Dog. Silas saw him first. He stepped out onto the porch, his scarred face impassive, his body blocking the doorway. "Abe," Silas said. His voice was flat. "Silas," the man returned, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. He squinted at Silas, his eyes glinting with a mean sort of amusement. "Heard you was still up here. Thought maybe that face of yours had finally scared the bears off for good." Silas did not react. "What do you want?" "Water for my horse. Maybe a sip of something for me. If you ain't as stingy as you are ugly. The creek's down the hill. You can water your horse. Then you ride on." Abe Finn's gaze slid past Silas into the shadows of the cabin, where Clara was standing, frozen. She had been putting away the bread. Her heart had stopped. Abe's face split into a slow, rotting grin. He recognized her. "Well, now," he breathed, his eyes traveling the length of her, hungry and leering. "If it ain't one of Jed's girls, Clara, ain't it? Last I saw you, you was entertaining that big-handed miner from Boise." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She was cold, so cold. Abe laughed, a wet, choking sound. He looked back at Silas, his grin widening with malice. You finally got yourself a woman, Silas, though you had to get one from the bottom of the barrel. What's the rate on this one?" Then, heard Jed was barely getting $1 for her by the end. She must have run off on him. He was right angry about it. Clara felt the floor tilt. The bread bowl slipped from her numb fingers and crashed onto the floor. Silas did not move. He did not flinch. His voice, when it came, was so cold it could have frozen the creek solid in the summer heat. "Abe, get on your horse, and do not ever ride back up this way." It was not a request. It was a judgment. Abe's grin faltered. He knew Silas. He knew the stories. He looked at the sheer, broad stillness of the scarred man in the doorway, and the malice in his eyes turned to a grudging fear. "No need to get sour," Abe muttered, pulling on his reins. "Just being friendly. A man can ask a question." "Not on my land," Silas said. Abe Finn spat one more time, his gaze lingering on Clara with a final, possessive insult. He tugged his horse's head around and trotted back down the trail, disappearing into the pines. The silence he left behind was terrible. Clara stood among the shards of the broken bowl, shaking. She could still feel the trapper's eyes on her, stripping her bare, branding her. All the work, all the new muscle, all the pride, it was all a lie. She was still just that girl, Jed's girl, the one from the bottom of the barrel. She looked at Silas. He had not turned. His back was still to her, a rigid wall of muscle. He was staring at the space where the trapper had been. He knew, he had heard, and now he saw her as Abe Finn saw her, as a used, worthless thing he had picked up. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound humiliation it was almost a scream. She turned and fled. She ran out the back door, past the coop, past the barn. She ran until she reached the stream, and she knelt by the water, her stomach heaving. She wanted to wash her skin. She wanted to scrub it raw until the memory of that man's gaze was gone. She was dirty. She was so dirty. She was scrubbing her face with the icy water when his shadow fell over her. She flinched, curling in on herself, expecting him to tell her to get back to work, or to leave. Now that he knew the full, ugly truth. He did not speak. He just knelt beside her on the muddy bank. She kept her face hidden, her wet hair falling over her shoulders. "Clara!" His voice was rough. She shook her head, unable to look at him. He reached out, not to touch her, but to block her view of the water. His large, calloused hand just hung in the air between them. "Look at me." Slowly, her sobs quieting to ragged breaths. She lifted her head. She looked at him. His face was a mask of old pain. His good eye was clear and steady. He did not look at her with disgust. He did not look at her with pity. He knelt before her, in the mud. He, the master of this homestead, knelt to her. "You do not belong to the past," he said, his voice low and fierce. "And you do not belong to him, or to that place." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "You belong to yourself." She stared at him, the world narrowing to his scarred face. He was not just defending her from Abe Finn. He was defending her from her own shame. He was telling her she was not a property to be claimed or discarded. She was herself. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but it was not a tear of shame. It was something else entirely. Their bond, which had been forged in silence and shared labor, was now sealed in something stronger. He had seen the very worst of her past, named and thrown at her feet, and he had not turned away. He taught her to ride his old mare, Molly. The horse was a gentle, sway-backed creature, but Clara was terrified. It was so large, so powerful. "She can feel you shaking," Silas said, his hand on the bridle. "She thinks you're scared. You just got to show her you ain't." "I am," Clara whispered. "I know," he said, "but you can be scared and be in charge. They ain't opposite things." He put his hands over hers on the reins. It was the first time he had truly, deliberately touched her for more than a second. His skin was rough, his hands enormous, but his touch was light. "Pull left to go left, right to go right, pull back to stop, and mean it. She knows if you don't mean it." He led her around the clearing, and then he let go. Clara was alone on the horse's back. She felt the power beneath her, the animal's breath, the way the world looked different from 3 feet higher up. She tentatively squeezed her heels, and Molly began to walk. She found a joy in it, a wildness. This was not work. This was not survival. This was something else. It was movement. It was freedom. She rode out to the edge of the clearing, the wind pulling at her hair, and she looked back at Silas. He was leaning against the fence, arms crossed, watching her, and she smiled. The 4th of July arrived. To them, it was just another Tuesday. The sun rose, the chickens were fed, the garden was hoed. There was no flag, no celebration. But when Clara went to the cabin at midday to fetch water, she saw it. Lying on her bearskin rug, where her head would be, was a single, simple, white ribbon. She stopped. The tin dipper fell from her hand with a clatter. It was not a dress, it was not a ring, it was a ribbon, plain, clean, and perfectly white. She picked it up. She held it like it was made of spun glass. It was his answer. It was his question. Again, but this time, he had provided the first part of the reply. Wear white. She held it to her chest, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She was trembling. That night, they sat on the porch. The air was warm and thick with the smell of pine. The stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in the sky. Clara had the ribbon tied in her hair. She had felt his eyes on it all evening. The silence was deafening. It was full of the ribbon, of his hand on hers, of her past, of his grief. She could not stand it. She could not wait for him to ask again. She had been chosen by men, taken by men, and discarded by men. But this one time, she would be the one to choose. She stood up from her chair and walked the 2 steps to where he sat. He looked up at her, his face half in shadow, half in starlight. The scars looked like canyons on his skin. He looked beautiful. She did not give herself time to think. She reached out, her hand shaking, and she touched his face. She laid her palm against the scarred, ruined skin. He flinched, his whole body going rigid, but he did not pull away. His eye closed. "Clara," he whispered. It was a warning. "I want to choose," she replied, her voice thick. She leaned down, and she kissed him. It was awkward. Her lips met his, and he was stiff, unmoving. She was clumsy, terrified, but she did not pull back. She pressed her mouth against his, tasting the faint salt of his skin. The day's labor. It was slow, and it was burning with a need so deep it frightened her. He made a sound, a low groan, and his hand came up, grabbing her arm. He pulled away, breaking the kiss. His breathing was ragged. His one good eye was wide, full of a raw, painful light. "Do not," he rasped. "Do not." Rush what you do not truly want. You do not owe me this. This is not work. I know, she said. She was crying, but she was not sad. I know it is not work. I want to... Silas. She touched his face again, her fingers tracing the edge of his beard. This time, I want to be the one who says yes. He looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. He was searching her face, looking for debt, for gratitude, for fear. He found only her. Slowly, he stood up. He was so much taller than her. He took her hand, his large, rough palm swallowing hers. He did not lead her to his cot. He did not lead her to her rug. He led her to the barn, to the ladder that went up to the hayloft. He went up first, then reached down for her. She took his hand and he pulled her up. The loft was warm, the air sweet and dusty with dry hay. The great loft door was open to the night, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. They stood in the center of the loft, bathed in starlight. He touched her hair, his fingers finding the white ribbon. He undid the knot, his movements slow, reverent. The ribbon fell away. He kissed her. This time, it was not clumsy. It was not a question. It was an answer. He kissed her with all the pent-up grief and loneliness and years of isolation. His beard was rough against her skin, but his mouth was gentle. He laid her down in the hay. They moved slowly, their clothes shed with trembling hands. For Clara, it was the first time she had been touched without violence, without transactional coldness. For Silas, it was the first time he had touched a woman since the fire, since he had become a monster in his own eyes. His hands were reverent. His touch was slow. He looked at her as if she were a miracle. And when they came together, it was not a taking. It was a finding. It was quiet and slow, and it felt like healing. They lay tangled in the hay, under the stars, and for the first time in either of their lives, there was no shame. The hayloft, which had been a haven of starlight and discovery, was a simple barn loft again in the morning light. They descended the ladder in the dusty dawn, the smell of hay and sweet feed clinging to their skin. A new silence was between them, but it was not the silence of ghosts. It was a shared, warm quiet. When they stood in the cabin, he on his side of the hearth, she on hers, the space felt charged. He cleared his throat. "Coffee's on." She nodded, her hands fluttering as she went to get the mugs. Her hair, unpinned, fell over her shoulders. The white ribbon was still clutched in her hand. They were a new thing. Not master and servant, not yet husband and wife. They were two solitudes who had touched, who had chosen. The line had been erased. He slept on his cot, and she on her rug. But the nights were different. The cabin was no longer a refuge for two wounded animals. It was a home they were beginning to build. But the mountain was not an island. A world existed down the trail, and that world, Clara knew, was full of men like Abe Finn. Abe rode his tired horse for 6 hours, the beaver pelts bouncing, his mind sour. The slight from Silas, the man's cold, dead-eyed command, stuck in his craw. But worse was the girl, Clara, Jed's girl, looking clean, looking healthy, and the way the scarred man had stood in front of her, like a wall. He reached Pioneer's Rest by late afternoon. The town was little more than a single dusty street with a general store, a livery, and a saloon. He went, naturally, to the saloon. Over his third whiskey, he began to talk. "You know that monster up on the ridge? Silas, the one who burned his family?" Abe said to the bartender, his voice loud enough for the 3 other men in the room to hear. "He ain't alone no more." "Is that so?" the bartender said, wiping a glass. "Got himself a woman. Though woman is a fine word for it." Abe spat. "Recognized her. She's a runaway from Jed's place over in Murphy's Gulch. A saloon girl, and a cheap one at that. He's up there harboring a common, well, you know. Wonder what he paid." The story spread like a grass fire. It passed from the saloon to the general store, where it was picked up by Mrs. Agatha Reed. Agatha Reed was a woman who had buried 2 husbands, one from cholera, one from a mine collapse, and had turned her grief into a rigid, ironclad piety. She was the self-appointed moral compass of Pioneer's Rest. She had, for a brief time, considered Silas a potential third. He was a capable man with a solid homestead, and she had imagined herself marching up that mountain and bringing order to his chaos, scars and all. He had rebuffed her single charitable visit with such profound, absolute silence that her charity had curdled into a bitter resentment. To hear that this man, this hermit, this monster, had not chosen a decent, God-fearing widow, but was instead shacked up with a fallen woman, a fugitive, was more than an insult. It was a moral failing that demanded correction. She fanned the flames. "It is a disgrace," she declared at the next Sunday service, her voice ringing from the back pew. "He is harboring a fugitive, a woman of sin, right in our backyard. What example does that set? It invites indecency. It must be dealt with." The men, bored by the summer heat and stirred by Mrs. Reed's righteousness, and perhaps by the lingering image of a saloon girl on the mountain, found a cause. 2 days later, Clara was hanging their washed shirts on a line strung between 2 pines. The sun was hot on her back. She felt a profound sense of peace, the clean, wet cotton in her hands, the smell of lye soap, the hum of bees in the wildflowers. Then she heard it. "Horses, not one, many." She froze. She looked toward the cabin. Silas was already there, stepping out onto the porch, his face grim. He had heard them, too. "Go inside, Clara," he said. His voice was low, devoid of all the warmth she had come to know. It was the voice he had used with Abe Finn. "Bar the door. Silas, do it, now." She ran inside, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She slid the heavy wooden bar into place. She ran to the window, peering out from behind the rough curtain. They came into the clearing, 5 of them, 4 men on horseback, rifles resting across their saddles, and in the lead, sitting upright in a buckboard wagon, was Agatha Reed, holding a parasol against the sun like a scepter. Clara recognized one of the men, Sheriff Hayes. He looked older than she remembered from town, and he looked deeply uncomfortable. Silas stood on the porch, his hands empty, his body still. He was a wall. "Silas," one of the men, a thick-set man named Davies, called out. He was the owner of the general store. "We've come on a matter of public decency." Silas said nothing. "Mrs." Reed's voice cut through the air, sharp and high. "Silas, we know you have that woman in there, the runaway. You must hand her over." "This is my land," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they carried. "It may be your land," Davies said, shifting in his saddle. "But you're harboring a fugitive. We've had word from Murphy's Gulch. She's a thief, an indentured girl who broke contract. You have no right to keep her." "She is a stain on this community." "Mrs." Reed cried, her face flushed. "We are here to see she is returned to her rightful employer and faces the law for her sins." "Go home, Agatha," Silas said. "We are not leaving without her," another man said, lifting his rifle slightly. "Do not be a fool, Silas. She is not worth it." Inside, Clara heard those words. She is not worth it. She had heard it her whole life. She was the extra mouth to feed. She was the girl whose virtue was worth less than a bottle of whiskey. She was the one to be used and discarded. The old Clara would have hidden. She would have cowered by the hearth, praying they would go away, praying Silas would not be hurt, but too afraid to move. But the old Clara was gone. The woman who stood in the cabin, who had been taught to shoot, to ride, to choose, was new. The woman who had been told she belonged to herself. Her hand went to the wooden bar. She was terrified. Her whole body was a single, cold tremble. But she was not weak. She was scared, and she was in charge. She lifted the bar. The sound was a loud, scraping thud. Outside, the men tensed. Silas's head turned just slightly. The door creaked open. Clara stepped out into the sunlight. She was not the creature they had imagined. She was not painted or dressed in saloon silks. She was wearing a simple, mended calico dress. Her hair was tied back neatly. Her feet were bare, but she stood tall. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her knuckles white, but her face was calm. Agatha Reed gasped, affronted by the woman's simple presence. Clara looked past the men, her eyes landing on the widow. "I am not a fugitive," she said, her voice clear and steady. It did not shake. "I am free now." Then she looked at Silas, at his broad, strong back. She stepped forward to stand beside him on the porch. She looked at the men, at their rifles, at their judgment. "And I choose to stay." The statement hung in the hot, still air. It was not a plea. It was a fact. The men looked at each other, their righteous certainty faltering. This was not a cowering, sinful creature. This was a woman. Sheriff Hayes sighed, scrubbing a hand over his face. He nudged his horse forward. "All right, Agatha, Davies, that is enough." "Sheriff, she is a confessed fugitive," Agatha shrieked. "She is a woman on a man's property, stating she is here by choice," Hayes said, his voice tired but firm. "I do not have a warrant for her arrest. You are trespassing. All of you, ride out. Go on, now." "This is a failure of your duty." "My duty," Hayes said, turning his sharp gaze on her, "is to keep the peace, and you are the one breaking it. Go home." Davies and the other men looked sullen, but they would not move against the sheriff. They turned their horses, grumbling. Agatha Reed looked as if she had swallowed poison. She snapped the reins of her wagon, turning it in a cloud of dust. Her final look at Clara was one of pure, unadulterated venom. They rode out, leaving the clearing in a heavy, ringing silence. Sheriff Hayes did not leave. He dismounted, letting his horse drink from the trough. He looked at Silas, and the guilt he had carried for years was plain on his face. "Silas," he said, his voice low, "it's been a long time." Silas just nodded, his body still rigid. I remember the fire," Hayes said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "I remember how folks talked, how they treated you. I was new to the badge then. I was not much better. I let them say it. I am sorry for that." Silas looked at the man. His gaze softened. "Just a fraction." He nodded again. An acknowledgement. "Which is why I am here to tell you plain," Hayes continued, his voice dropping. "This is a bad business. That trapper, Abe Finn, he did more than talk. He sent word to Murphy's Gulch." Clara felt her blood run cold. "The man who held her contract, Jed," Hayes said, glancing at Clara. "He's filed a claim. Not for her, not really. He filed a legal claim of indenture, and for theft. Says she stole a dress and $50. That makes her a fugitive from federal law. That makes this a Marshall's business." He looked at Silas. "I can hold off the town. I can keep Agatha Reed and her righteousness at bay. But Silas, if a bounty man comes, or a marshal, if he comes with a federal warrant, my hands are tied. I cannot protect you from that. I will have to uphold the law." The words settled over them, heavy as a shroud. The world was coming for them. "You understand me?" Hayes asked. "I understand," Silas said. Hayes nodded. He mounted his horse. "Be careful. Silas, be watchful." He tipped his hat to Clara, his eyes full of a sad respect. And then he, too, was gone. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. They lived with the knowledge that any rider, any stranger, could be the one. Every snap of a twig, every call of a hawk made Clara jump. They worked, but a new tension hummed between them. Clara felt sick with guilt. "I brought this to you," she whispered that night, as they sat by the fire. "Your peace, I have ruined it." Silas stopped his work. He was sharpening an axe, the shing, shing, shing of the whetstone a rhythmic comfort. He set it down. "Abe Finn brought this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The town brought this. My peace was just a long time of being alone." He looked at her. "You brought, you—" He was not going to let her go. He was not going to let them take her. For the next few nights, after Clara was asleep, Silas worked. He built the fire in the small forge he used for mending tools. He took a silver dollar, one he had kept, and he began to hammer. He heated and hammered, folding the metal, shaping it. It was a slow, punishing process. He worked until his arms ached, until the silver was no longer a coin, but a simple, glowing band. He filed the edges smooth. He took a few long, coarse hairs from Molly's tail and braided them into a thin, strong cord, weaving it into a channel he had cut in the silver. On the fourth night, he woke her. "Clara." She sat up, her heart pounding, thinking the men had come back. "What is it?" He was kneeling by her rug, the firelight catching the planes of his face. He held out his hand. In his rough, massive palm was a ring. It was not delicate. It was simple, strong, and it shone with a soft, hammered light. "It is not law," he said, his voice thick, "and it is not church." He took her left hand. His thumb, calloused and warm, brushed her knuckles. He slid the ring onto her fourth finger. It fit perfectly. "It is just truth." She looked at the ring, the braid of dark hair set inside the silver. It was a piece of the mountain, a piece of him. It was a promise. She was his, and he was hers. "Silas," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He held her, his arms wrapping around her like steel bands. "We will make it law," he murmured into her hair. "In the fall, after the harvest, we will ride to Helena. It is 2 days, a bigger town. No one knows us. We will find a justice of the peace. We will register it." "Register the marriage," she repeated. It was a shield, a future. The unease did not go away, but it no longer ruled them. They had a plan. They had the ring. They had the truth. A week later, Silas brought in a piece of clear, perfect pine, cured and smooth as butter. He sat on the porch in the long summer dusk, and he began to carve. He was not mending tack or sharpening a tool. He was carving something new. Clara watched him for an hour, the long, careful strokes of his knife. "What is it you are making?" she finally asked. He looked up, his one good eye catching the copper light. A small, almost shy smile touched his lips. "A cradle." She stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. The implication was so enormous, so full of a hope she had not dared to touch. "For the future," he said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious thing in the world. She sat beside him and picked up a piece of sandpaper. She began to sand the rocker he had just finished. They worked together, building a thing for a life that had not yet begun, a defiant act of faith against the warrant that might be riding toward them. The cradle, and the work on it, seemed to unlatch something deep in Silas. The grief he guarded so well was closer to the surface. One evening, Clara was cleaning, truly cleaning, the cabin. She was organizing the large, battered trunk at the foot of his cot, the one that held his winter wools. She found the locket again, and smiled, touching it, but her fingers brushed against a loose board in the bottom. Curious, she pried it up. Beneath it was a small, hollow space, and in it, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a single object. She unwrapped it. It was a shoe, a tiny, leather baby shoe. It was impeccably made, but the entire left side was blackened, the leather curled and brittle from intense heat. She knew what it was. Her heart stopped. This was all that was left. She was still holding it when Silas came in from the barn. He stopped dead in the doorway. Seeing her, seeing what was in her hand, the color drained from his face. The solid, unmovable man looked, for a second, like he was going to shatter. I was cleaning, she whispered, holding it out. I did not mean to. I found it, after. He rascaled. His voice was a bare thread of sound. In the ash, it was all I could find. He walked over and took the shoe from her. He held it in his massive, scarred hand. He sat down heavily on the cot. He stared at the shoe, and for the first time, the walls he had built around his grief, the fortress he had guarded for years, collapsed. He did not make a sound, but his shoulders began to shake. A tear, then another, traced a clean path through the grime on his good cheek. He bent his head, his whole body racked with a silent, profound agony. Elsie, he choked out. Her name was Elsie. He had said her name. Clara's heart broke for him. She did not hesitate. She went to him, sat on the cot, and put her arms around him. He resisted for a second, his body rigid, and then he just let go. He leaned his great, heavy head against her shoulder, and he wept. He wept for his wife, for his daughter, for the fire, for the years of being alone, for the town's blame. Clara held him, her small, strong body a new wall against his sorrow. She stroked his hair, her own tears falling silently onto his shirt. You did not fail her, she whispered, her voice fierce. You did not. He gripped her, his hand clutching her dress, as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling into the fire. You kept her safe, Clara told him, holding his head tighter. You kept her safe with every quiet thing you built after this house, the fences, the garden. You kept her memory safe. You are not alone in the fire anymore. Silas. He pulled back, his face a ruin of grief and a new, raw love. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. She was his absolution. He kissed her. It was not the reverent, healing kiss of the hayloft. It was a kiss of desperation, of gratitude, of a heart breaking open and being put back together, all at once. He was no longer just guarding a well of grief. He was finally sharing it. The cradle was nearly finished. It sat by the hearth, the pine glowing warm and golden in the late summer light. They had worked on it together in the evenings, Silas carving the rockers, Clara sanding every surface until it was smooth as river stone. It was a defiant thing, a piece of a future they were daring to build. The harvest was good. The small garden plot had yielded enough beans, squash, and potatoes to see them through the winter. The unease that Sheriff Hayes had left in his wake had not disappeared, but it had settled, like silt at the bottom of a pond. They were watchful, but they were also building a life. Clara was humming, a small, absent sound. As she swept the porch, she felt Silas's eyes on her from the woodpile. He had stopped his work, just watching her, and a slow, warm smile touched her face. She looked up to meet his gaze, and in that instant, the peace shattered. A rider was coming up the trail. It was not Abe Finn. It was not the sheriff. This man rode a fine black gelding, not a tired nag. He wore a black suit, clean despite the dust, and a bowler hat. He was clean-shaven, and as he rode into the clearing, he took off his hat, revealing pale, neat hair. He looked like a banker or a preacher. Clara's hand tightened on the broom. The humming died in her throat. Silas stepped out from the woodpile, his axe still in his hand, though he held it loosely. At his side, he moved to the foot of the porch steps, placing himself between Clara and the stranger. The man reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping the homestead with a cool, appraising look. He noted the tidy cabin, the full wood pile, the woman on the porch. Then his eyes, a pale, flat blue, settled on Clara, They were entirely without pity. They were, Clara thought, the cruelest eyes she had ever seen. "Good afternoon," the man said. His voice was educated, with no trace of the mountains. "I am looking for a fugitive." Silas said nothing. His stillness was a warning. The man dismounted, his movements fluid and unhurried. He was not armed, not visibly. He looped his reins over the fence. "My name is Philip Warren. I am an agent, contracted by Mr. Jedediah Stone of Murphy's Gulch." Clara felt the porch boards beneath her feet. She was not sure her legs would hold her. This was him. This was the man Hayes had warned them about. "You are on private land," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble. "I am aware," Warren said, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He wore a vest, and pinned to it was a small, silver badge, a U.S. Marshal's badge. "I have a federal warrant for the arrest of one Clara Miller, for theft and for breaking a legal indenture contract." He looked past Silas, directly at Clara. "You are Clara Miller. You will come with me. There is a $50 bounty. And Mr. Stone wants his property returned." Property, the word, spoken so calmly, so legally, undid her. Silas took one step forward. "She is not property, and she is not leaving." Warren's thin lips twitched. It was not a smile. "Ah, the protector. I was told about you, the man with the ruined face, playing house with a runaway." "How much?" Silas said, his voice flat. Warren raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" "The bounty is 50. I have 70 in the cabin. I will give you 80. For you to lose the warrant. For you to ride on and say you never found her." The man, Warren, actually laughed. It was a short, dry, barking sound. "You think this is about $50? This is about the law, you ignorant animal. It is about a contract. It is about reminding things like her that they cannot just run." He looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a cold contempt. "And it is about putting things like you back in your place." He took a step. "Now, stand aside." "No," Silas said. "I said, stand aside." Warren's hand, which had been resting on his vest, moved. It was not a lunge. It was a blur. He drew a small, nickel-plated revolver from a holster hidden beneath his suit coat. It all happened in a single terrible second. Warren drew. Silas did not wait. He was not a gunman. He was a survivor. He lunged, not at the gun, but at the man, roaring. His axe dropping from his hand, he covered the distance in one desperate bound. He hit Warren high, at the chest, taking the man's first punch to his jaw, a crack of bone on bone. Silas ignored it, driving the man backward with his sheer weight. Warren fired. The shot went wild, the bullet screaming past Silas's head. "Clara, run!" Silas bellowed, his arms locked around the man. Clara did not run. She stood frozen for one heartbeat. Then she turned and scrambled into the cabin. She did not hide. She grabbed the Winchester from its pegs above the door. Outside, the sounds were awful, the grunts of two men in a desperate fight, the thud of fists. They crashed off the porch, a tangle of limbs in the dust. Warren was strong, wiry, and he was fighting dirty. His knee coming up, his fingers gouging at Silas's good eye. Silas roared again, a sound of pure, animal rage, and slammed his fist into the man's side. Clara burst back onto the porch, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift the rifle. She pulled back the hammer. The men were on the ground. She could not get a clear shot. "Silas!" she screamed. Her scream made Warren look up. He saw her, the rifle, and he smiled. He shoved Silas off him, a sudden, desperate heave, and scrambled to his feet. He raised his revolver, aiming it directly at Clara. Clara froze, the sightline wavering. "No!" Silas yelled. Silas, on his knees, threw himself forward, not at the man, but at the gun, tackling Warren around the waist just as he fired. The boom of the rifle and the crack of the revolver came almost at the same time. Clara's shot went wide, splintering the top rail of the fence. The bounty hunter's bullet, meant for her, tore through Silas's left shoulder. Silas screamed, a high, agonizing sound, but his momentum carried them both to the ground. He was on top. The man's gun was trapped between their bodies. Warren was trying to bring it up, to fire again into Silas's stomach. Silas, his left arm useless, blood pouring through his shirt, grabbed the man's wrist with his right hand. He slammed the man's hand, the gun still in it, against the hard-packed earth. Once, twice. The man's head was free. He head-butted Silas, snapping his head back. Silas's lips split open. The man was strong. He was turning the gun. Silas, with a final, desperate surge, let go of the man's wrist. He grabbed the heavy, bloody rock that his own axe had dislodged from the woodpile earlier. He raised it high. He brought it down on Philip Warren's clean-shaven, pale-haired head. There was a sickening, wet thud. The man's body went rigid, then limp. The silence that fell over the clearing was absolute. There was only the ringing in Clara's ears, the smell of gunpowder and blood, and the sound of Silas on his hands and knees, gasping for breath. Clara dropped the rifle. She ran, stumbling down the steps. "Silas! Silas!" He was on all fours, his head hanging, blood dripping from his shoulder, his lip and his bruised jaw, forming a dark pool in the dust. The dead bounty hunter lay beside him, his pale blue eyes open to the pale blue sky. He drew on you," Silas panted, his body shaking. "You are bleeding! My God, Silas, you are bleeding!" She knelt, her hands hovering, terrified to touch him. The wound in his shoulder was a dark, gaping hole. "Inside," he grunted. "Get me inside." She got her shoulder under his good arm, and somehow she hauled him to his feet. He was a dead weight, his feet dragging. He collapsed onto the cot, his face a waxy, pale gray. Clara was numb. The terror was so cold it had frozen her. She looked at the dead man outside, then at Silas, who was bleeding on his own bed. The man," she stammered. "We have to bury him," Silas said. His teeth gritted against the pain. Before others. "I cannot, Silas, I cannot." "You can," he whispered. He gripped her hand with his good one, his grip surprisingly strong. "Get the shovel. We drag him. To the pines. Go." It was a nightmare. Clara, moving like a woman in a dream, got the shovel. Silas, leaning on her, managed to stand. Together, they dragged the body. Warren's fine suit snagged on roots. His heels left two long, straight lines in the dust. They found a soft patch of earth under the pines, near where the snowmelt ran. Clara dug, Silas, leaning against a tree, his face slick with sweat, watched, his hand pressed to his shoulder. She dug until her hands were raw, until the hole was deep enough. They rolled him in. He landed face down. Clara threw the first shovelful of dirt onto his back. The sound was final. She was numb. She had just helped bury a man. They stumbled back to the cabin. Clara tore strips from a clean bedsheet. She packed the wound as best she could, but the blood kept coming. The bullet was deep. "It is not good, Silas," she whispered, her hands shaking. "I know." He lay back, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. He was not alone. Jed sent him. When he does not return, they will send another, or a marshal, a real one, not just a hunter. "What do we do?" she cried. He opened his eyes. His one good eye, bruised and swelling, found hers. "We ride now." "You cannot. You will bleed to death. You have a fever already." "If we stay, they will come. They will hang me for this. And they will take you." He gripped her arm. "This is the only way. We go to Hayes. We tell him the truth. We tell him. It was self-defense. We register the marriage. It is our only chance. Clara, get the horses. The ride was an agony. Clara packed supplies with frantic, clumsy hands: bacon, flour, bandages, ammunition. She took the white ribbon from the shelf and shoved it in her pocket. She helped Silas, groaning and half-conscious, onto Molly. She rode the mule, leading the mare. She had the rifle across her lap. She was no longer the one being led. She was the one leading. They rode through the dusk, into the full dark. They could not go fast. Every jolt sent a new wave of pain through Silas. By midnight, he was slumping, his speech slurred by fever. Clara knew he could not make it to town. She found a small, sheltered clearing and half-carried, half-dragged him from the horse. She built a fire, her hands moving with a desperate, practiced speed. She laid him near it, covering him with all their blankets. His skin was on fire, but he was shivering. "Clara," he murmured, his eyes rolling. "I am here, Silas. I am right here." "My fault. Should have been faster." "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, washing away the grime. She bathed his face with a wet rag. "This is my fault. I brought this blood to your home." He found her hand, his fingers cold despite the fever. "No, my choice. The hayloft, the ring." He was struggling to speak. "My choice. You are my choice." She sat all night, the rifle across her knees, watching the darkness. She listened to his ragged breathing, changing the bandage on his shoulder when it soaked through, forcing sips of water between his lips. She watched the woods, her guilt and fear a living, crawling thing on her skin. She was a wife, and she was a widow. She was a free woman, and she was a murderer. At the first gray light of dawn, she got him back on the horse. They rode into Pioneer's Rest like specters. The town was just waking. A few people stopped, staring at the sight of the scarred man slumped over his horse, held in the saddle by a fierce, wild-eyed woman caked in mud and blood. Clara did not look at them. She led the horses straight to the sheriff's office and slammed her fist on the door. Hayes opened it, a cup of coffee in his hand. He took in the scene, the blood, Silas's gray face. Clara's desperation and his own face went pale. "My God, get him inside! On the cot! Mary!" He yelled toward the small house behind the office. "Mary, get the doctor, now!" They got Silas onto the cot in the office's single jail cell. Mary Hayes, a kind, sturdy woman, ran in with bandages and whiskey. "What happened?" Hayes demanded, turning to Clara. Clara, her voice hoarse, told him. She told him everything. The man's name, the badge, the offer of money, the refusal, the way Warren had mocked them, the way he had drawn on her. "Silas, he took the bullet for me," she whispered. He killed him. We buried him, under the pines." Hayes listened, his face grim. He ran a hand through his hair. He looked at the federal warrant that was still on his desk, the one for Clara Miller. "He drew on you," Hayes said, his voice flat. "Yes, he was going to shoot me. Silas stopped him." Hayes looked at Silas, who was groaning as Mary cut away the bloody shirt. He looked at Clara, who had the ring, the simple silver and horsehair ring, on her finger. "He drew first, on an unarmed woman," Hayes said, his voice now firm. "A decision made. On Silas's own property. Silas defended his home and his wife." He picked up the warrant. He looked at it, then at Clara. His eyes, which had been hard with the law, softened. "This warrant," he said, "is for a Clara Miller, a fugitive, a woman who, by all reports, ran into the wilderness and was never seen again." He tore the paper in half, then in half again. He dropped the pieces into the cold stove. "That is what my report will say. A bounty hunter, Philip Warren passed through, asked questions, rode north toward the mountains. Never saw him again. He must have lost her trail. He looked at Clara. You are not Clara Miller. You are Mrs. Silas Cole. That is what I will write. Clara began to cry, silent, racking sobs of pure, unadulterated relief. But we have to make it law, Hayes said, his voice gentle. Right now, before that doctor gets here and starts asking questions. He was a justice of the peace. He told Mary to stand as witness. I cannot, Clara whispered, looking at her filthy dress, her hands caked in dirt and his blood. You can, Mary Hayes said softly. She wet a cloth and gently wiped Clara's face. Clara, her hands shaking, reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled white ribbon. She tied it in her tangled, matted hair. They stood in the back room of the sheriff's house, which was really just his small, clean parlor. The doctor was on his way. Silas was sitting in a chair, propped up by Mary. He was pale, stiff with pain, his jaw swollen and purple, his lips split. He was a ruin of a man. But when Clara stood in front of him, the white ribbon in her hair, he looked at her, and he smiled. He smiled through the blood and the bruises. Do you, Silas Cole, Hayes said, his voice formal, take this woman, Clara Miller, to be your lawful wedded wife? I do, Silas rasped, his eyes never leaving hers. Do you, Clara Miller, take this man, Silas Cole, to be your lawful wedded husband? I do, she whispered. Then, by the power vested in me by the Idaho Territory, I pronounce you man and wife. They did not kiss. Silas was too weak, but he reached out his good hand, and she took it. The ring, his truth, was now the law. They did not go home. The doctor came and dug the bullet from Silas's shoulder. The wound was infected. A fever set in, a dangerous, breaking fever that lasted for 10 days. They stayed in the back room of the sheriff's house. Mary and Clara tended him. Clara did not leave his side, bathing his face, holding his hand when he cried out in his delirium. Seeing the fire, seeing Elsie, seeing Warren. You are not alone, she would whisper, hour after hour. I am here. I am your wife. You are not alone. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks for the fever to break, for the flesh to begin knitting, for Silas to be able to stand on his own. The town knew. The story was told, and retold, and twisted. But the facts remained. The scarred man was married. The warrant was gone. Agatha Reed, for once, had nothing to say. One morning, Silas stood on his own, fully dressed. He was thinner, his face gaunt, his left arm in a sling, but he was alive. They bought supplies. They thanked Mary, who packed them food for the journey. They shook Sheriff Hayes's hand. Be well, you two, Hayes said, his eyes kind. The ride home was slow. They led a new pack mule, loaded with provisions they had not been able to harvest. They did not talk much. They rode into the clearing. It was just as they had left it. Silent. The dust was thick. The rifle still lay on the porch. The dead man's bloodstain was a dark patch by the steps. Under the pines, the earth on the new grave had settled. Clara dismounted. She walked onto the porch. Silas followed, moving slowly. She looked at the grave, then at his shoulder. He looked at her, at the ring on her finger. Everything was the same, and everything was changed. A peace settled over the homestead. It was not the light, fragile peace of summer. It was a heavy peace, a winter peace. They knew what it had cost. They had paid for it in full. Clara picked up the broom from where she had dropped it. A lifetime ago. She went inside the cabin, their cabin, and began to sweep. The heavy peace that settled over the homestead was cemented by the first snowfall. It came early, not with a gentle dusting, but as a thick, determined blanket, as if the sky itself had decided to cover the scars of the summer. The first flakes fell in late October, and by the second day, the world was white and silent. The new grave under the pines was a smooth, uninterrupted mound. The dark bloodstain by the porch steps, which Clara had scrubbed at until her knuckles were raw, was finally, mercifully, gone from sight. They were sealed in. The world was the cabin, the barn, and the short, muffled path between them. Silas's shoulder healed, but it healed badly. The doctor had been rough, and the infection had been deep. The joint was stiff, his left arm permanently weaker. He could no longer swing the axe with the same fluid power. He bore the new limitation with the same stoic silence he bore his old scars. It was just another mark the world had left on him. His new weakness meant more of the heavy work fell to Clara. She split the kindling, she hauled the water, she mucked the stalls, and Silas watched her. He watched her with a new, sharp anxiety. He watched her in the mornings, when she would stand by the hearth, her face pale and greenish in the firelight before she would rush out into the snow. He watched her in the afternoons, when she would stop mid-task, her hand on her back, her breath coming short. He watched the way she moved, slower, more deliberate, a new caution in her steps. One morning, she was kneading the bread, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Clara." She looked up. He was standing by the cot, his good hand clenched. He had been watching her for weeks. "You are tired," he said. It was not a question. "The wood is heavy," she lied, pushing a lock of hair from her damp forehead. "I am just weary." He walked to her, slowly. He did not touch her. He just looked at the way her dress, which had been loose, now fit snugly across her stomach. He was a man who had been a husband, a father. He knew. "No," he said, his voice a low, rough thing. "It is not that." Clara stopped kneading. She looked down at her hands, covered in flour. She was terrified. She had survived a bounty hunter, a gunfight, but this was an unknown. Her body, which she had finally claimed as her own, was no longer hers, and the world was a place that took children, that burned them, that left tiny, singed shoes in the ash. "I am scared, Silas," she whispered, and the confession broke her. A tear dripped into the dough. He did not hesitate. He stepped forward and put his good arm around her, pulling her against his chest. His hand, large and calloused, spread wide over her back. "I know," he murmured into her hair. "Me too." But when he pulled away, he looked at her belly, and his one good eye was filled with a light of such profound, raw gratitude that it stole her breath. He, who had lost everything, was being given a second chance. The fear was real, but the gratitude was bigger. The work shifted. Silas took the heavier tasks, the ones that required strength, even if they took him twice as long with his stiff arm. He would not let her lift the heavy water buckets. He chopped the wood, his swing short and awkward, but determined. And he began to build. Clara came in from the coop one afternoon to the sound of sawing. He had brought boards in from the barn, clean, cured pine. "What are you doing?" she asked. "The cradle is done," he said, not looking up from his work. "But a child cannot sleep by the fire. It is not safe. And this room, it is not big enough for 3. He was building a second room. He knocked out the small window on the east wall, framed in a new doorway, in the biting cold. With the snow piled deep outside, he began to build their future. He built a small, solid room, just big or enough for a proper bed, for the cradle, for a life. Clara helped. She mixed the mud and straw to chink the logs, her hands freezing but her heart warm. The thud of his hammer was the only sound for weeks, a steady, defiant beat against the silence of the snow. It was the sound of a man building a fortress for his new family. They talked by the fire in the evenings, The new room a dark, unfinished promise behind them. The cradle sat in the light, a finished thing. "I have been thinking," Silas said one night. He was holding the small, singed baby shoe. He had put it on the mantel, next to the wildflowers she had dried. "About a name." Clara watched him, her heart aching. "If it is a girl," he said, his voice thick, I would like to call her Elsie." He did not need to explain. It was not replacing the daughter he had lost. It was honoring her. It was a continuation. "Elsie," Clara whispered. She tested the name. It felt right. It felt like healing. "Yes, I would like that." He looked at her, his gratitude a tangible thing. "And if it is a boy?" Clara looked into the flames. She had not thought of her own past, only his. But now she reached back, to a time before Murphy's Gulch, before the hunger, to the small, crowded tenement room she had shared with her family. "Jonas," she said. Silas looked at her. "My brother, my younger brother. He was always kind. He would save bits of bread for me." She smiled, a small, sad smile. "He died. Diphtheria. I was 12. He was the only one who ever saw me. Before you." Silas reached out and took her hand. He entwined his fingers with hers, the silver and horsehair ring pressing against her skin. "Elsie," he said, "or Jonas, it is a good future." The snow held until March, when the pass was finally clear enough to risk the ride. Silas took the mule to Pioneer's Rest for supplies. Clara, now heavy with the child, could not go. She stood on the porch, wrapped in his heavy coat, and watched him ride away. It was the first time they had been separated since the wedding. She was terrified. The world outside the homestead was still a threat. The grave under the pines was a constant reminder. "Be safe," she whispered, her hand on her belly. He was gone for 3 days. Clara slept with the rifle beside the bed, starting at every sound, at the cry of a wolf, at the scrape of a branch. When she finally saw him riding up the trail, leading the mule, she nearly collapsed in relief. She walked out to meet him. He dismounted, his face grim, but he held her tight with his good arm. "All is well," he said, before she could even ask. "All is quiet." He had the usual: salt, flour, coffee, and nails for the new room. But he had something else. A single letter, folded and sealed with wax. "Sheriff Hayes gave it to me," Silas said, pulling it from his coat. "It came weeks ago. He was holding it." It was addressed in a looping, feminine hand. To Clara Miller, care of Sheriff Hayes, Pioneer's Rest. Her old name. She took the letter, her hands trembling. She did not know anyone in the world who would write to her. She opened it by the fire. Silas sat across from her, watching. It began, "Dear Clara, you will not remember me, but my name is Sarah, and I was at the Red Dog. I was the one with the yellow hair." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. She remembered a young, terrified girl from Ohio. "I am writing to you because I heard what happened. I heard Abe Finn talking. And then I heard you were gone. And then I heard you was safe. I heard you was married. I did not know if it was true, but you getting out, it gave me a courage I did not have. I thought, if Clara can do it, maybe I can. I ran. I did not go north. I went west. I walked for 2 weeks. It was hard. But I made it to Oregon. I met a man, a rancher. His name is Ben. I told him the truth. Clara, I told him everything, and he said it did not matter. We was married last month. He knows my past, and he says it is just the past. I am safe. I am happy. I wanted to tell you. I wanted to thank you. You saved me. Clara, you being brave, it saved me. Your friend, Sarah." Clara let the letter fall into her lap. She was crying, but they were not the tears of shame or fear or even relief. They were tears of a strange, profound connection. She was not the only one. Her escape, her choice, had rippled out into the world and saved someone else. She was not just a survivor. She was a start. Silas knelt in front of her. "What is it?" She gave him the letter. He read it, his brow furrowed. When he finished, he looked at her, and his one good eye was full of a fierce pride. "Hope," he said. It was the only word he needed. The nightmares did not stop. The new room was finished, a real bed built and set, the cradle beside it. They lay together in the darkness, and the trauma of his past would still find him. He would thrash, his good hand gripping the blankets, a low, animal sound in his throat. "The smoke! Anne, I cannot breathe! Elsie!" In the beginning, Clara had been frightened. She would shake him awake, and he would sit up, disoriented and ashamed. But now, she did not wake him. When he cried out, his body rigid with the memory of the fire, she would move closer. She would put her arm over his chest, her hand flat over his heart. She would press her face into his back, her own body large with their child, a solid living anchor. "I am here," she would whisper into his skin. "You are not alone in the fire, Silas. I am here. You are not alone." He would not wake, but the thrashing would gentle, his breathing would deepen, and he would turn, even in his sleep, reaching for her, holding on to her. He was no longer the lone survivor. He was a husband, and he was not alone. The baby came in spring. It came, as all things on the mountain, with violence. The snow was melting, the creek a raging torrent, the world awash in mud and new life. Clara's labor began in the middle of the night, a sharp, sudden pain that stole her breath. "Silas," she gasped. It is time." He was awake in an instant. All the fear he had held at bay all winter was now in his face. He built up the fire, he boiled the water, he laid out the clean cloths Mary Hayes had given him. He was all business, his movements quick, but his one good eye was wide with terror. It was a long, hard labor. The sun rose, and the pain became a relentless, tearing wave. This was not the quick, easy birth of an animal. This was a fight. By the afternoon, Clara was exhausted. She was screaming, her voice raw. She was not the stoic, quiet woman. She was a body in agony. "I cannot do it! Silas!" she cried, gripping his hand so hard he should have winced. "I cannot! It is killing me!" "You can," he said, his voice a low, desperate prayer. He wiped her face with a cool cloth. "You are strong. You are stronger than anyone. You can do this." But by nightfall, something was wrong. The agony had turned to a dull, terrifying exhaustion. Clara was weak. The baby was not coming. She was bleeding. Too much. "Silas," she panted, her eyes rolling back. I am so cold." He saw the blood. He saw her face, waxy and pale, the same color he had been when she brought him to the sheriff. He was losing her. He was losing them both. The fire was here again. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "No, Clara, you do not, you stay." He was helpless. There was no doctor, there was no one. It was just him, and the woman he loved, and the fire. He fell to his knees by the bed. He, who had cursed God and the world, bowed his head. He did not speak. He just gripped her hand, his body shaking. He prayed, "Please, not again, not her. Take the arm, take the other eye, take me, but not her. Please." He stayed like that, his head bent, his heart breaking. A final, desperate surge. Clara gave a low, tearing moan, and then a new sound, a thin, wet, angry wail. "The baby." Silas lunged, his hands shaking. He caught the child. It was messy and bloody, and it was screaming. It was alive. He barely looked. His eyes were on Clara. She had fallen back, her eyes closed, her hand limp in his. "Clara," he whispered. He touched her cheek. She was cold. "Clara!" He cleaned the child in a frantic, terrifying haze. A girl, a tiny, perfect girl. He cut the cord, his hands clumsy. He wrapped her in a blanket. He rubbed Clara's wrists. He put a cold cloth on her head. He did not know what to do. He sat by the bed, the tiny, wailing bundle in his good arm, and he held Clara's hand. He just sat, and he watched, and he prayed. She woke to the smell of wood smoke. The cabin was dim. The sun was setting, the light a soft, copper color. Her body was a distant, hollow ache. She was alive. She turned her head. He was there. He was slumped in the chair beside the bed, his head down on the mattress, asleep. His shoulders were slumped in exhaustion. He was holding her hand, and in the crook of his other arm, bundled in his own coat, was a tiny, sleeping child. A small sound escaped her. His head snapped up. His face was a ruin of exhaustion. Tear tracks on his cheeks, his eyes red. He looked at her, and the world seemed to stop. "Clara," he breathed. It was a prayer answered. She was too weak to move. She just looked at him, at the man who had pulled her from the mud, who had knelt to her, who had taken a bullet for her, who had just pulled her back from death. "I'll wear white beside you," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Forever." He broke. He bent his head and he wept, quiet, gasping sobs of a man who had been to the edge of the abyss and been pulled back. He kissed her forehead, his beard rough, his lips warm. "It is a girl," he choked out. He lifted the bundle. He placed the baby in the crook of Clara's arm. She was so small, so warm. She had a full head of dark hair. "Elsie," Clara whispered, touching the baby's cheek. "Hello, Elsie." Silas kissed his wife's forehead, and then his daughter's. His family was here. The fire was out. The final scene was years later. The homestead was larger. The small, one-room addition was now a proper part of a house that had grown. A solid corral stood near the barn. The grave under the pines was still there, but it was now marked with a simple wooden cross, and wildflowers grew over it. It was a bright summer afternoon. Silas, older now, his beard more gray than black, his limp more pronounced, stood in the center of the corral. His scarred face was softened by a deep, permanent peace. He was holding the bridle of the old mare, Molly, and on the horse's back sat a little girl of 5, her dark hair flying. She was laughing, her small hands gripping the saddle horn. "Hold on, Elsie," Silas said, his voice the same low rumble, but it was full of a gentle adoration. "Let her walk. Feel the move. That's it. You are not scared. You are in charge." On the porch, in a rocking chair Silas had built, sat Clara. She was no longer the gaunt, haunted girl. She was a woman. Her face filled out, her hands strong and capable. A few lines of care and laughter were etched around her eyes. She was wrapped in a simple white shawl, her hands busy mending a small shirt. She looked up, and she watched her husband and her daughter. She watched the scarred, broken man who had offered her a choice, and the child who was the living, breathing proof of it. They had built a life from his ash and her shame. They had taken the broken pieces of their pasts and forged a future. And the mountains, which had once been their prison, now stood guard, a silent, towering witness, holding their love like a secret no one could ever take. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so you can connect with other folks. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.